Hey there, welcome. We're going to be talking philosophy today. Specifically, what is philosophy based off Raymond Geuss's book. We're going to talk through 12 thinkers that he talks about. And we're going to avoid biographical details too much, but we're just going to talk about the 12 thinkers and the questions that they phrase. Because Geuss thinks that philosophy, Raymond Geuss, the author, thinks that philosophy is a matter of changing the subject. So philosophy really happens when, I think his phrase is, the situation changes. And that's his phrase of what philosophy is. So who is Raymond Geuss? Raymond Geuss is a philosopher based in Cambridge. He taught at Cambridge and he worked within social and political philosophy. He has a sensitivity for history in debates around the methodology of political philosophy. I'll link to courses of lectures that he did at Cambridge in winter of 2013 on Nietzsche and Marx, or Marxism. I'll link that below. But he's an interesting figure. But this is, I would say, almost an introduction to philosophy. If you've never read philosophy, you could definitely read this and understand what philosophy is. But you've got to understand the claim of that philosophy is changing the subject is somewhat controversial, because philosophy, or what philosophy is a metaphilosophical question in of itself in philosophy. So what is philosophy? Geuss thinks it's changing the subject, and he shies away from his introduction from giving any essence to what philosophy is. He writes something like, philosophy takes place when someone or a group begins to look for a way of transforming the framework of inquiry which they are in. So he even says it might be a mistake, as I just mentioned, that philosophy has an essence. Which is a controversial take, because some think, philosophy is logical analysis, it's like proletariat kind of revolutionary demands of philosophy, bourgeois kind of like middle class questions. So this is not a contribution to academic philosophy. It's like just a good introduction, as I say, and I hope this video is somewhat similar. He bases all 12 philosophers, bases the core structure of it off a work. So for starters, Socrates, the Apology of Socrates, where he was put to death for corrupting the youth of Athens. He was put to death, drunk hemlock. And the question that Socrates really wanted to ask was, what is the good and how do we get self-knowledge of the good? So it's, Socratic dialectic is in Plato's dialogues. Socrates interrogates people to get answers for the essences of things like justice, love, beauty, etc. So this is kind of his methods to get self-knowledge of the good. Knowledge being justified true belief, justified because you have a reason to be justified for it, belief, a belief that you have, and true corresponding to a true state of affairs. So Socrates kind of really started what we call ethics with his famous phrase, an unexamined life is not a life worth living. So that's Socrates. All we know from Socrates comes from Plato, his student. Plato's main work, which I would recommend actually starting with as a good primary text to start with, is The Republic. He uses his famous cave analogy. The cave analogy kind of is a metaphysical metaphor for the idea of a good. So for Plato, the real perfect world is not this physical world like the stuff around here, like with books and stuff. There is a world transcendent beyond the immanent reality that we live in, and the job for the philosopher is getting out the cave, because the real world is shadows on the wall of the cave, and that's the physical world, and the real world is the world of the intellect, where the intellect resides. So the idea is that the question he really wants to ask is, how do we sort of instigate good for a city, for example? And how do we instigate that? We have philosopher kings. And philosopher kings are trained to sort of understand the abstract nature of good and things like that, and understand the essence of them. So the functioning of a knife is good insofar as it's sharp. The functioning for a human is good insofar as they attain the good. And there's a kind of like psychological coherence to it, that there's, within souls, that people have a nature, etc. So that is Plato, and then we're going to skip ahead. Controversially, we're going to skip out Aristotle, but that's just Geuss. Lucretius kind of like puts a downer on it a little bit. No, I'm only joking, but he's a proto kind of existentialist. I haven't read Lucretius. I've got an old battered copy from a bookshop here. But Lucretius is like a poet. He deals with physics, ethics, and religion. The physics comes from Epicurean atomism, which is like, where we get the word atom from. But the real question he wants to ask is, do gods have a plan for us, or are the gods even interested in what we do? The Christian God is omnipresent, etc. But are they even interested in us? And like, it's a sobering thought, I suppose. A lot of philosophy can be a sobering thought. But there's kind of like this statement that Geuss says is like, everything is always the same, because, there's atomism in things. And this is pre-Socrates. There was a lot of physicists, what you call physicists, metaphysicists or metaphysicians, concerned about the ultimate reality. And Lucretius really brings this together in his long form poetry. But are the gods even interested in us? It's a sobering question. But yeah, so we're going to go to a later Roman thinker now in Geuss's work, Saint Augustine. The text that Augustine wrote is A City of God. I haven't got it here. I've been wanting to read it. I've only read parts of it. But the real question that he frames is, what should count as a real historical understanding of an event? He witnessed the sacking of Rome, so he reflects on that sacking of Rome. So where is history going? And very different to Lucretius, he thinks that there isn't a nature, or no, there is different natures to different sort of belief systems. Almost, a Christian is different to obviously a Christian being good for him because he's Christian, and Saint Augustine. But there is kind of like a balance between the city of God and the earthly city, which is like earth, and there's like a balance there. And I don't know too much about Augustine, and it was a good little read to understand a bit much more about him. But he kind of is different to Lucretius, for example, in that real change is possible, and history is like, a matter of events with significant meaning and maybe a telos, and by telos we mean like an end or a function. So there is vast differences between the natures of humans, and understanding historical events as kind of like a telos towards God is kind of the takeaway I got from Saint Augustine. So we're going to go 3,000 years to Michel de Montaigne, which is he basically invented the essays. Really, I've only read a few essays of his. Really interesting figure, French, and he's really skeptical of like these natural universal ethics that people like Socrates and Plato would say. So if we see knowledge is justified true belief, as I mentioned earlier, he kind of wants to be skeptical, because he's a skeptic of knowledge, and he says we're on good terms with topics, and he wants to get out of like scholastic, dogmatic kind of philosophy, which was current in medieval Europe of the time. So his real questions are there even answers to the questions that we ask of the world? Like, do we know? Are we going to get answers to these questions? And there's kind of like an accidental, chaotic sort of aspect to the world that people like Plato and Aristotle put reason on a pedestal. And we shouldn't, I don't think he's an amoralist, but he's skeptical that there is kind of a universal natural ethics and there's a natural good to obtain. So that is Michel de Montaigne, a really interesting figure, and skeptical of knowing the good and knowledge itself, or skeptical of reason as well, which is there's kind of a theme, minor theme throughout history, is skepticism of reason. And we can move on maybe 100 years to someone probably quite relevant to Geuss's own work, which is Thomas Hobbes, the Leviathan. He kind of argues for a sovereign. So the question he asks is, how do we avoid the state of nature? So the state of nature for him is like a thought experiment, which goes on, like, you just have individuals. So obviously we're in a state now. He would have been writing in response to the English Civil War. So before there was a government or a state, we're in a state of nature where it's kind of like short, brutal, and nasty is kind of like the phrase. I might have mixed up the linear wording of that, but like his idea of human nature is we're self-interested, we have property, and we want to we're just creatures of desire, and we desire to be self-interested. Self-preservation is a key. So how do we mediate that human nature? We create an artificial state and a sort of like a representational body for the public good to avoid the instability of, say, real world events like the English Civil War. So we create legitimacy for government. Government is legitimate, because they can provide stability for the subjects, so they can, pursue their own self-preservation or self-interest. And that's, like, you can see the sovereign there is the Leviathan, which is a biblical figure, the Leviathan. So that is Thomas Hobbes. We consent to a state to avoid violence of the state of nature, and he starts what we call the social contract theory. So we go on to a few hundred years to Hegel. Hegel's a really interesting figure, really dense. People hate reading him because he wrote in a certain way, but there's a reason why he wrote that. But the main sort of important nature of this for Geuss is that philosophy for Hegel is trapped within its own time. Hegel is extremely self-conscious of things, like that's where self-aware of philosophy of his own time, writing post-Enlightenment, early 1800s. So is philosophy limited by its own historical development? And what is the telos, again, that function end coming out, what is the telos of history? Maybe sort of similar to St. Augustine in that sense, but he kind of understands history through grand narratives, and totality is key. He has the Hegelian dialectic, which we can make a whole video on in itself, but it's not thesis, antithesis, synthesis. That's not Hegelian dialectic. Hegelian dialectic is about totality and kind of like interdependent things. You could say this book is dialectical because there's an interdependence between the chapters, and they're not just singular. And Geuss does that in a lot of his essays. But a key term is spirit. So spirit is kind of like a concept that forms through recognition, relationships in a framework that allows intelligibility of society. So, totality of history is pursuing a sort of end of history. And when we say end of history, we don't mean, events stop. What we mean by end of history is kind of like a conceptual end, almost. But philosophy is different for Hegel compared to Socrates and Plato. Philosophy for Hegel is speculative, not a practical endeavour. It's not about getting sort of like moral principles and telling people how to act. It's about conceptually understanding. So his absolute idealism doesn't absolutely justify moral principles. His absolute idealism claims that things and subjects can be understood as a totality of relations. So that's kind of a basic understanding of Hegel. So spirit is kind of like a cultural norms, and ethics is related to real world concrete practices in of itself. So we move on to Nietzsche. The main text for Hegel was Phenomenology of Spirit, where he dialectically understands, goes from common sense to absolute knowledge for Hegel. And then the next text is Genealogy of Morals by Friedrich Nietzsche. Extremely influential. He critiques Christianity and morality, really asks the question of what is the value of values and where do these kind of come from. So the term is like good and evil are Christianity terms. There's evil, but that kind of reflects kind of like a natural state of affairs of the world, of a state of affairs. It's good to be a noble and bad to be a peasant. Therefore, moral systems arise from these kind of like material situations almost. And his famous quote, going against Socrates and Plato, all footnotes to them, as Whitehead once said, only which has no history can be defined. So concepts like justice, which have a vast history, someone like Michel Foucault really took seriously, and even Geuss himself, is that there is no essence to things which have a concrete history, and that's a really interesting perspective. And this goes on to how there is facts, but there's always a perspective interpreting facts, and we have a will to power as beings. That is a complex concept and not easily definable, will to power for Nietzsche, but it kind of represents that humans have drives, and we have desires, and a drive to things, and like an interpretation. And so philosophy is the job of philosophy for Nietzsche, or the philosopher, is to view things from a variety of different angles without becoming unstable from it. So understanding this kind of like perspectivism is key to Nietzsche, and his many masks, as someone like Gilles Deleuze would say. So life is filled with illusions which we can't actually escape, but we can locate, and that's the job for philosophy for Nietzsche. So we move on probably about 20 years actually after Nietzsche's death, and we go to Georg Lukács. I'm probably mispronouncing that, so I apologise to my Hungarian viewers. But philosophy for Lukács is not autonomous or eternal, like certain figures think. Philosophy, which Geuss takes really key from, philosophy responds to cultural practices and history. So it's not autonomous, and forms of knowledge are sociologically structured, and knowledge helps society function. So how much power, this is the question that Lukács wants to say, how much power do beliefs have in how we live. So that sort of goes to the term ideology, and also how do we obtain collective consciousness about our historical context. So there's this term reification, which is kind of a critique of capitalism and how capitalism objectifies subjects, and how do we agents collectively free ourselves from this reification, from alienation, because we don't own the means of production, and how can we how can we organise knowledge so it can emancipate people? How can you can't see class; it's not immediate to you. So how do we understand conceptually, make it intelligible to people, create a consciousness of these things like class? And he kind of suggests that power and freedom are interrelated concepts to, say, belief and knowledge. Again, he's a Hegelian Lukács, so there's a totality there, but with a bit of Marxism sprinkled in. So we go next to Martin Heidegger, arguably the greatest philosopher of the 20th century, arguably. I'm still going to be reading this soon, being in time. But he really fundamentally challenges philosophy, especially Plato, and asks the question of what is being. So he kind of suggests that the idea that we have to prove there's an external world or consciousness just doesn't really make sense. We're being in the world. We extend our being by being in the world. He uses techniques, hammers. We extend into the world. And humans, or Dasein, which his phrase is being there. Humans are inclined to care for being naturally as a mode of being. So what is the meaning of this being? And it's kind of like a fundamental ontology because it goes beyond, say, sort of substance theories, and we're understanding this fundamental ontology of thrownness into a world and the finitude of our existence and the anxiety that comes from then, and understanding our projection, the fact that we will die, and we all die, and that's kind of this fundamental nature to Heidegger's philosophy, and this distinction between truth, which is related to care, and correctness, which relates to propositions. I say there's a cat on a mat, that is a correct, not a true statement. True really relates to what we pay attention to. So that's Heidegger's really seminal, and the idea of being really was influential for a lot of philosophers. So we go on to Wittgenstein, Philosophical Investigations, which is a later work, is where Geuss takes from. But his early questions are, he changes his mind because he wrote the Tractus Logico Philosophicus. But the question he really wants to ask is, are philosophical problems just a matter of our language? And he's really obsessed with language and logic and how we say things. And he has this term language games, and language is like a game. So his earlier thing was that if I say there's a cat on a mat, it's a correspondence to reality. But that he kind of goes away from that correspondence theory of truth and towards maybe, I don't know, an idea of language of games. Like football, for example, brings in VAR. Language works like that. If you think of slang, there's a becoming to language. It's always changing, and the rules and inferences that we make in language are always changing. No one decides it; it just kind of changes, and that's kind of his main thing. And there's language communities there. And he also has a thing is philosophy just an obsession of the ill-fated, which is quite funny and sort of leads to his quietist position. But that's Wittgenstein. And then lastly we have Adorno. Adorno is one of my favourite philosophers, Frankfurt School critical theorist, cultural industry, which Max Horkheimer he wrote with. But he really wants to sort of challenge Socrates' original sort of unexamined life and living life rightly. Is saying, can we live... do ethics? Can we live a right life in such an unjust world, especially post Auschwitz, because he was Jewish and he escaped the Nazis, Adorno. So this kind of reaction to capitalism and fascism really fundamentally changed these questions that he asked. How can we live rightly in a wrong world? Is kind of a quote from Minima, Moralia, which is the Geuss's text here. And he kind of suggests that the world is everywhere is becoming California, American capitalist, and there is everything is industrialized and commodified and reified, which is a Lukács term. Everything's an object and a commodity to be sold, and and that's how can philosophy be done in such a weird world where it's just abundance? We could end world hunger, but we choose not to. And so this kind of unjust world, how can we do philosophy? So he later has something called negative ethics, which is a really good book. Adorno's Practical Philosophy sort of elucidates that. But that's Adorno, and those are the 12 thinkers. So to summarise, philosophy is really concerned with thinking, concept, objects, being, problems, answers, puzzles. It's conceptual questions about the world in broad terms, like how things, as one philosopher said, Wilfrid Sellers, how things hang together loosely. So if we think of chess as like a closed system, philosophy is dealing with the world, which is an open system, and like how can we understand philosophy? And Geuss kind of ends this book by sort of like raising some questions, not really definitively answering anything. And so, why does philosophy arise, and what is philosophy today? You know, it's an institution and powerful thing. Like, what is philosophy today outside the university? Like, all these philosophers, mainly, apart from like maybe 2 or 3, didn't work in universities. So he sort of ends the book by saying, there are, however, questions that do not go away, even if we know we cannot adequately answer them. And I think that last sentence really summarises what philosophy is, like this kind of like open system questions, but there is kind of like the persistence of not normative, but persistence of questions that do arise. So I hope this was a nice little quick introduction to those 12 thinkers, and I really encourage you to read this. I'll put some more secondary literature in the description below, and videos, etc. And there'll be more videos coming from this channel. I hope you have a nice day, and thank you for watching.